In February 2020, the Brooks Institute hosted approximately 80 of the most influential actors in the animal protection community to discuss the current state of the animal protection movement. Some of these Congress delegates volunteered to respond to big questions. Here are the responses to the question, what is the biggest challenge or opportunity for the animal protection movement?
To have law and policy, you need laws on the books. And one serious problem facing animals right now is that industries that use them tend to self-regulate. So the farming industry largely makes up its own rules and doesn't always have regulations and public oversight from government. This runs very deep, so even the enforcement of animal cruelty laws is largely done in many jurisdictions by SPCAs or humane societies, which are themselves private charities and rely largely on private donations to do their work. So the idea that animal protection is a matter that should be taken care of privately by individuals who care or individuals who use animals instead of a matter for public concern and government oversight, I think is a serious challenge. And I believe that there's room to start to see that paradigm being chipped away at. So moving law enforcement into the public sphere and introducing strong regulations to govern these industries instead of letting them make up their own rules.
Well, I think in a way, the largest obstacles are sort of the biggest opportunities, and that's another way of looking at it. But certainly one of the big obstacles is the lack of sort of societal acceptance of animals being seen as worthy of protection. That is a big problem. And then until you get that, it's very hard for the law to then pick up and know where to go, which direction to move in. So I think that's very, very important to get that sort of that societal kind of consensus, or at least some sense of consensus, and then the law can lead and once you get that. But the fact that animals don't have political representation of their interests, I think is an issue that is also very, very important. And so I think groups like Animal Justice, they're really helping to sort of pave the way for that kind of an understanding for animals, and then you can get your society, your politics, and your law kind of all on the same page. And that's sort of the sense in which I think animal protection is moving. And as Camille mentioned, we're here this weekend to canvass all different ideas coming from players in all different sort of sectors as to how do we get there.
So the biggest challenge, I think, in animal protection is a traditional, long-standing perception of how we think of animals. We think of them as things we own, things we eat, things we kill. We think about them as property. We've had anti-cruelty laws, animal cruelty laws, for 200 years. Martin's Act was passed in the UK in 1822. So we're nearly coming up for the 200th anniversary. And that started saying that being cruel to animals was just not right. It was the wrong thing to do. And I think there was a lot of public acceptance for that. But that's only 200 years. And although I don't think people want to be cruel, I don't think we want to be harsh to animals, also we've no longer really got the same idea. We don't have the same connection with animals. So the idea of a sausage or a burger or a steak doesn't really connect us with the idea of killing a living animal. So I think the biggest single change will be getting a sense of responsibility towards sentient animals. The second problem, I think, and it's particularly so for the animal rights law, which is what we focus on, the second problem is going to be the paradigm shift that's going to be produced, because animal rights will have huge implication for farm animals. There will be very few farmed animals. It'll have huge implications for laboratory testing. There won't be any. Wild animals will have rights, which is going to have implications for things like national parks and those sort of things. So I think the biggest challenge is going to be the idea that our paradigm about our relation with animals is going to have to be different. Now, as I say, I think people are thoughtful. Don't think people want to be cruel or unkind. And as an alternate paradigm, it's a perfectly good one. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing intrinsic that we say, well, you have to do these things. So I think the biggest challenge is going to be that. On the other hand, I think the benefits will be seen not just in terms of welfare and the way we treat animals. I think animal rights are going to have implications for things like cruelty and violence, because in many ways the way we treat animals, certainly slaughter, is almost the last outpost of recognized and approved violence. And that's going to change. And then at an even higher level, it's about respect for sentience, respect for things that are alive because they're alive, and because we should be excited and thrilled and take pleasure, rather than seeing them as objects and things to be eaten or swept away or dealt with. So I think it'll feed back into our humanity. So I think the implications are really quite huge. So I'm looking forward to it. I do tell my students we could be talking 30 to 60 years. So it's going to take a while.
Yes. So after, 18 years of researching and teaching and really thinking deeply about these issues, I strongly believe that an untapped opportunity, for the most part, is for the movement to reach out to human children in their early childhood years, so as to reach them with the message before they get a chance to formulate, let alone entrench, their views about who animals are and what they deserve and how humans should treat them. I think that if the movement can amplify and really make pervasive its humane educational efforts, so bringing an animal rights message, a nuanced message, age-appropriate message into schools, into libraries, into books, into apps, into film, everything that kids are exposed to today at a very early stage, that we have a chance of taking what are already, for many children, natural affinities toward animals, and instead of them losing that as they age and being shamed about their emotions or compassion, transforming that into something valued and respected, and so then transforming the majoritarian values, perhaps even in one generation. I think a part of that is to make sure that we cultivate empathy in kids, and that's not a kind of a singular type of track project. Children have to be well supported in their own upbringing before I think they have to develop the capacity for empathy. They have to be supported, and before they can be empathetic toward others. So we have to be really, really vigilant looking at gaps in upbringing for kids, so that they have that supported upbringing, so that they can then be empathetic toward animals.
Even if information isn't the only thing that persuades people, I do think the facts are on our side. When we look at the exploitation of animals, we look at the scale of that exploitation, we look at the consequences of that exploitation for the animals, of course, but also for the environment, for our own human communities. I think there's very little way to support that there's a net benefit of that kind of exploitation of animals. I think it's going to build on a lot of the work that's been done until now, and I think there's been extraordinary work that has been done in the last 40, 50, even we could say 100 years, right, to anti-vivisection movements that were in the UK and other places, even 1,000 years. Emperors in India were having edicts on the kind treatment of animals. So I think it's probably going to take certainly information, also more linkages, more strategic work across organizations, also in some ways across movements. I think with the environmental movement, the climate change movement, there are many, many people and organizations really concerned about biodiversity loss as well. I think we can find more linkages with those movements, especially around animal agriculture and exploitation of wildlife. I also think there's probably a need for more capacity development in varied ways. And we see the movement becoming more professional in terms of research, in terms of writing, in terms of analysis. I think that's great. I do still think there's a strong value in organizing and really movement building. And I also see the US animal protection movement and European as well having strong links and things to learn, and also learn from movements in other parts of the world. So, for example, there are people who care about animals in Kenya. right? And that might seem obvious, but to some people it seems like, no, it's just a Western industrialized country thing. There are people who care about animals in China. There are people who care about climate change all throughout the world. So I think that the animal protection movement has potential to be even more powerful and impactful in certain circumstances, to see about linking with other movements, but also helping organize grassroots power in policy contexts. For example, in the UN Climate Change Convention, which is the main global policymaking body for climate change, there's really no constituency there advocating for animals, even though animals, of course, live on the planet, right? And there are billions and trillions of them. So we've been doing a lot of work now on animal agriculture, which I think is very important, and obviously there's a strong case there. But it's still kind of an instrumental view, right? Don't use animals for food. It's not the same as saying, look, animals are suffering the consequences of climate change. We are responsible, or at least largely the majority is human responsibility, human activities. How do we advocate for those animals? What are some of the policy measures? Is it interventions to provide water in drought situations for wildlife, not just domesticated animals? Is it planning? Is it changing how we deal with cities? But right now, apart from some indigenous groups and a little bit of environmental interest, there really aren't people talking about animals as animals. I think there's a real potential for growth in that. And the other reason I would say the potential is I do think there's a generational shift, that younger people, let's say 30 and younger, wherever I encounter them, in China, in Paraguay, in New York, in Europe, there is among many of them, not all of them, of course, but more interest across issues. They're environmentalists, they care about climate, they care about animals. They care about power between North and South. They care about the power of corporations. They care about social movements. And I actually think there's real potential there. Not that it's easy, not that there won't be backlash, and those of us who've been doing this work and many others for many years know that. The course of change is not a straight line, but I really think there's huge potential.
Currently, this issue is affecting farmed animals, and protecting farmed animals and reconstructing our food system is affecting more individual animals than any other issue. And we have to treat it like that, which means it should be considered an emergency. And it's not just affecting those farmed animals, it's affecting the survival of our planet, many, many other species, and ourselves. And we need to treat it with that kind of urgency, yet the kind of attention at the political, at the corporate, and at the philanthropic level, it's not reflective of that. And that has to change. And we have to think about, how do we change that? I think the key to changing that is not thinking about it in silos, not thinking about it just, for example, from like a animal ethics perspective. We have to bring in all the arguments that factory farming negatively impacts communities, our health, the environment, species, the survival of our planet, the survival of our species, all these things. We have to bring in all the elements and not just take a narrow approach down like one highway. We have to take over all the roads to get there.
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we face in terms of animal protection is recognizing that we can no longer afford to be a movement based on moral awakening for personal change. We are a movement that can no longer be in opposition to cruelty on an individual level. I think that is correct. We need an analysis of a systemic change, which will be forced on us whether we want to or not. And so what I would like to see animal rights and veganism as a whole do is declare victory and say, this is the future that we imagine. I want us to be the people who say, this is our vision of how we live in relationship to wild animals, formerly domesticated animals, the ecosystem as a whole. This is where we see farmers and ranchers and fishermen in the future, restorers of ecosystems, protectors of watersheds, bioscientists, stewards of habitat, valuable members of the community as they allow the rewilding, the carbon sequestration, the carbon farming, the wind farming, the solar farming, the water farming, the biodiversity farming, as a way of protecting this planet against the ravages of the climate crisis. I would like to see veganism being not about deprivation, but providing the resources to magnify the number of food sources that we have by 10,000-fold because of research that we've done into the manifold varieties of peas and beans, as well as all sorts of other kinds of grains, so that we are not about depriving people of their 5 different kinds of meat that they eat, but we are the creators of variety, of pleasure, and most significantly for me, survival. And all of that depends on diversity. Diversity of approaches, diversity of stories, diversity of ecosystems, diversity of cultures, diversity of people's orientations. Because what is killing us now is monoculturation. Fields and fields of soy and corn and wheat, destroying the biodiverse rainforests. Plantations of trees, as far as the eye can see, destroying the biodiversity that is contained in old growth forest and natural woodland. A diversity of a monoculture of political viewpoints, a monoculture of the nation state and ethnic identity, and a sort of digging down on it's our way or no way, whatever that particular project may be. Because if that's the case, then we are all going to perish. None of that is a protective mechanism. And how do we know that? Because nature tells us that. Nature needs the diversity. So if one ecosystem collapses, another ecosystem takes on that life. And so that for me is the heart. It is how do we get more diversity in every single way in order to allow some of us, at least, to survive.
And in Safe Humane, one of the things that I'm really proud of is that by being founded on bringing together dogs that have been abused with people who have been impacted by violence and by trauma, by bringing them together to help each other, we learn a lot about the language and ideas. And the Court Case Dog program, which is one of Safe Humane's program, is a one-of-a-kind program in the country. We've done it for 10 years, and I think it needs to be a model in that it looks at those dogs that have been abused by owners and have a criminal court case associated with them, not just evidence. And they are part of a whole court system and a community value, I would say. And we need to take that program, help those dogs, bring them together with those communities. And I think we have a lot to learn from that.
I think the animal protection movement needs to look at how we can bridge with other movements, how we ensure that we're not working in a silo, and how we appeal to people's compassion. Because I think ultimately we are born with a deep sense of compassion and connection to other beings. I think that slowly gets eroded, and that's why I think it's absolutely critical that we reach young people in all the different ways that we can, through social media, through documentaries. There are a multitude of ways that we can reach people, and that's really why I also think that film is absolutely critical. So it's multifaceted, but we really need to look at how we can reach young people.